welcome back. You're watching Raw News Insight. I always do that. Someone actually called me out on this the other day. Someone was like, Enoch, I always watch your show, and you always start by saying you're listening to rather than you're watching. It's a video now. You are watching Raw News Insight, a premier news show here on 12:51 AM, where we give you Warwick students a chance to comment on the biggest story of the week on and off campus. Today we're going to be talking about Lockdown 2.0. Boris Johnson is now putting us in a month-long lockdown until the review date, as Michael Gove said, of December 2nd. What does that mean for you, and what are the new rules and restrictions being put in place? Also, the report into Labour incentives was finally released last week, and it led to Jeremy Corbyn being removed from the Labour Party, at least or suspended under investigation. So we're going to talk about that, and also we'll be previewing the US election and what we'll interview for you. I'm very lucky to be joined by the president of JSOC, or co-president of JSOC, Toby. Toby, welcome to the stream. Toby, you scored a very big victory the other day, didn't you? Want to tell us about it?
Yeah, I mean, first, lovely to be here again. Acting co-president, technically, but doesn't fit as well in the masthead. So this week, God, it's been a long week. It must have been Tuesday? The University of Warwick finally agreed to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, so the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, after what has been a very long 11 months of campaigning by myself, by my predecessors, and other members of the society. So yeah, a good news story from this week.
I mean, I remember when you first told me about this, I was almost shocked to hear Warwick had already accepted it. And what took them so long?
That is a very good question, and it was part of the contents of the letter we sent to the Vice Chancellor, Stuart Croft, which in part triggered this decision. Since, God, it must have been March maybe, was the last correspondence we had with the university. And since then, we sent various letters chasing them up. The Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is a national representative organisation, along with the Union of Jewish Students, had sent a letter asking what was the delay, basically. So yeah, it seems that the Vice Chancellor's tactic had been to postpone thinking about the decision for as long as possible. But in the meantime, and using lockdown as a pretense. And while they have been busy, in the meantime, the University of York managed to adopt the definition. So part of the contents of our letter was saying that, frankly, the safety of Jewish students can't be put on hold like that. Like, it's not a good enough excuse.
Yeah. I mean, would you say Warwick is failing on anti-Semitism then?
I think there have been failures in the past. This seems to be a message of goodwill, and they're keen to improve. They're keen to listen to the voice of Jewish students to get better. I think there's been a general uptick in anti-Semitism on university campuses from both the left and the right. So at Warwick, you had one of the founding members of National Action, the now proscribed fascist terrorist group, was a Warwick student. But you've also had a few, some of them quite high-profile instances of left-wing anti-Semitism. And so this general uptick has led to some of our members genuinely worrying. We've had letters and Facebook messages from potential students, from current students, from potential parents of Warwick students. So this isn't just some abstract debate. This is genuine worries by people.
Let's talk about campus for a bit. Let's talk about more generally the situation across the country. Last week, the report into Labour anti-Semitism finally came out. There's no word than damning. I know you've read the report. What are your thoughts on it?
So Thursday I woke up and spent a good from 10 till 12 sitting in bed reading 130 pages of legalese, essentially. I think for many Jewish Labour members like myself, it was reassuring. It was sort of like a final recognition that what we've been banging on about for the last few years isn't just this made-up problem, but now a statutory body has ruled that not only is there a problem, the party was acting unlawfully. And the recommendations from it were pretty thorough. A lot of them were pointing out recommendations from previous inquiries, like the Chakrabarti report, which the party has just failed to act on. Sorry, pardon that. So it was in many ways a relief for that 3 hours while the story remained on the report before things sort of got a little more dramatic.
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about that a bit more later in the show. But I want to open this up to the rest of the panel now. Toby, thank you so much for talking to us there briefly. I want to bring the rest of the panel in. Let's start with long-time Raw regular Noah. Noah, welcome to the stream.
Hello, Enoch and Toby. Brilliant to be back here again on Insight. How are you keeping?
Oh, well, we're good. Now, Noah, I heard something over the weekend. I heard you're on Ian Dale's podcast.
Well, yes, I have been on Ian Dale's podcast, not on it myself, but it's the For the Many podcast that Ian Dale, who's an LBC presenter, does with Jackie Smith, who was the former Labour Home Secretary under Gordon Brown and was on Strictly Come Dancing until she was eliminated at the weekend. But yeah, I am one of their regular questioners at their podcast. They've answered quite a few of my questions, and I've been one of their listeners since the start. Actually, this November marks their third anniversary since the podcast began. So I don't know where you heard this from, Enoch, but unless you listen to the podcast yourself.
Oh well, I couldn't possibly comment. But no, I think every time I feel like you're everywhere, Noah. You're in all the big newspapers I read. You're all over the place. You're making some real moves.
Yeah, that's probably one of the only good things about sort of this lockdown self-isolation period is that it has provided more time. But I think mainly it's just having opinions on lots of things and wanting other people to hear them, whether or not they're actually factually accurate. So I'd say that's the main reason for any sort of success.
Yeah. Well, we go from a man who's always on the show to a newcomer to Insight. Adam, welcome to the stream.
Hello, Enoch. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming on. Now, Adam, you're a postgraduate, right?
Yes.
Are you, do you do research or do you do some teaching?
No, so I'm on a PGT at the moment,
Okay.
doing the MA in public policy. I'm looking at the prospect of a PhD as well. So I do find the research absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So what are you currently looking into?
So what I'm currently looking into is, so on the public policy program, I'm currently looking into some of the theoretical traditions surrounding public policy. But my real interests at the moment are around intelligence and security, particularly given issues around fake news and media manipulation.
Yeah. Well, good to have you on the show there. Maybe you can help keep us honest here on Raw News. Yeah. And now, last but not least, another fellow Raw News host. We're going to add Cam Hall. Cam, welcome to the stream.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back.
Now, see, Cam, it's your birthday today, correct?
I believe you've even got me the banner. I'm on. Thank you.
Well, I know. We have a little treat for you, Cam. So here's happy birthday to you.
Thanks.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.
I'm honoured. Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's the first time we've ever celebrated anyone's birthday on Insight. So congratulations, Cam. You've made it first. Well, moving away from that happy topic to something slightly more serious, far more serious. Let's discuss the situation in the Labour Party and the report that was released this Thursday. Which, Toby, could you briefly summarise some of the report's statements for us?
Yeah, happy to. So this report is by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who are the regulatory body for the Equalities Act. So essentially, the big piece of anti-discrimination legislation the Labour government passed, this is the organisation that's charged with upholding it. And so, 3 years ago now, a couple of groups, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and the Jewish Labour Movement, referred the Labour Party to this body, essentially saying not only was the Labour Party failing on anti-Semitism, but alleging they were unlawfully acting. And the report confirms this. There were 3 cases. I want to say unlawful harassment, so by agents of the party. So that was the case for Ken Livingston and a Labour councillor somewhere whose name I can't remember, along with failures in leadership institutionally, and there was a third account that's somewhere on my computer. But essentially, not only was anti-Semitism a problem, but the party acted unlawfully. And if they don't act upon these recommendations outlined in the report in the next 6 weeks, then they're in breach of the law, and then EHRC can use executive powers to force their hand, essentially.
Yeah. So obviously, this report. I mean, when I read it, I was absolutely shocked by the claims it made. Keyly, the political interference by the leader's office in the case of anti-Semitism, which was, I guess, assumed to implicate Jeremy Corbyn in his handling of the whole crisis. Corbyn put out a statement very shortly after the report was released, which many people accused of trying to minimise what the report was saying, placing more blame on the media than on his own party leadership. And a few hours later, he was removed from the Labour Party. I want to ask the panel: do you think that was a good idea? Do you think it was right that Jeremy Corbyn has been suspended? under pending investigation. Toby, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think my main concern is that the suspension of Corbyn has distracted the conversation away from the findings of the report. And I think Corbyn, in the statement he put out, despite warnings from Angela Rayner and various members of the party that it was a bad idea, essentially, did that. But so did many members of the press who used Starmer's press conference on the HRC to keep asking him about Corbyn. And so what you've had is a story that should have been about Jewish members who put up with some just absolutely horrendous harassment over the last few years, has become a story about Corbyn. Given the statement he put out, the statement he chose to put out, using what should have been an example platform to say sorry, to voice contrition, using that platform to minimize the problem. Like, I think it was an understandable decision. I'm not sure if I would have made it, but I'm not mad about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And Noah, I'll come to you.
I think the story really is remarkable, and as you said earlier, Enoch damning from start to finish. And as Toby was talking about, one of the last pieces of New Labour legislation was the Equality Act in 2010. So to think that that party is now being investigated on the basis of legislation they introduced in the final days before David Cameron became Prime Minister is truly remarkable. And it was sort of shocking to hear about it on the news on Thursday. It's long-awaited publication. And I think it's important to remember that Jeremy Corbyn was suspended not because of what he did or didn't do as leader, not because of what the report says, but because of the statement reacting to the report. Now, as far as I'm aware, Keir Starmer spoke to Jeremy Corbyn. This might be incorrect, but from what I've heard, he spoke to Jeremy Corbyn the evening before the report was published, where they discussed it. And Keir Starmer made it clear that he didn't want people in the Labour Party that were saying, oh, anti-Semitism is simply over-exaggerated. And yet Jeremy Corbyn willingly on his Facebook page put out a statement where he just sort of once again referred to the media and once again referred to it being over-exaggerated. Now, given Keir Starmer in his sort of apology speech where he said how sorry he was on behalf of himself and the Labour Party, given that he said, if you believe it's over-exaggerated and that it's not a problem, we don't want you to be in the party, then I'm not sure what choice he really had. And so Corbyn has been suspended for bringing the party into disrepute. And it'll have to go down to an investigation. But as I say, like Toby said, I think the only flaw in it would be distracting from the more important issues. The media attention almost turned away from the report and simply to the suspension. So it's important to keep both in the equation.
Can I just quickly cut in?
yeah, no,
I think
please,
we need to be really clear when we're talking about this. When we're saying Keir Starmer suspended Corbyn, that one, we're not sure to be the case, and if it is the case, raises lots of other questions about political interference, which was much of the concentration of the report. As the public record currently stands, the decision was made by Richard Evans, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, not by Keir Starmer, although there are questions about that. Just thought it important to clarify.
No, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll take you on your advice, Toby, and Noah. I'll move away from talking about Jeremy Corbyn. Let's go back to the actual detail of the situation. Let's start with Keir Starmer's big apology speech. Then, Keir, it seemed for sort of years, for many people said Labour Party could not say sorry about anti-Semitism. Toby, I'm going to keep coming to you. How did it feel to watch Keir Starmer just say, "I'm sorry"?
No, yeah, it was a really genuinely quite emotional moment. I was sitting in bed on my laptop reading this bloody report and I teared up. It's amazing how simple but how powerful it is for someone just to apologize and genuinely apologize. It felt like a very sincere apology. And I think Lisa Nandy did this really well. In the leadership election, we've seen some of the responses from other MPs have said this really well. But yeah, after what has been a really emotionally draining and exhausting few years, just a sincere apology goes a long, long way.
Yeah, but obviously now the apology's been made. What's the next step? What does Labour do from here?
Was this back to me again? Sorry.
Yes,
yeah.
back to you again.
Yeah, so the HRC, as a statutory body and as a formal investigation, has a pretty clear list of findings at the end of it, which Keir Starmer has committed wholeheartedly to implementing. And in fact, he doesn't really have much choice on the matter, because if he refuses to, they can use executive powers to enforce them. And that was another problem within Corbyn's statement, that he used that to say he agreed with the vast majority of the conclusions of the HRC report, which I think raised some alarm bells for some people. But yeah, so it looks as though the party is just going to take the instructions they've been given and finally just sort the problem out, what they should have done 5 years ago.
I'll now open the question to you. I'll come to you, Adam. What do you think? What does Labour do where does Labour go from here?
Well, where Labour needs to go now is really focusing on those recommendations in the report and really being able to evidence how the culture within the party is changing in respect to that. Now, Sir Keir Starmer made it very clear when he took leadership that this was a new leadership for the Labour Party when they held their virtual connected conference. He unveiled the banner of a new leadership. It was introduced actually by Ruth Smeeth, a prominent now ex MP who was Jewish, who was put through the ringer completely over anti-Semitism and had to suffer such horrific attacks. So he himself has made it very clear where he's going, but Labour are going to need to see this through, and they cannot afford to have any more distractions of people coming forward with things that are either anti-Semitic or might appear to be downplaying the really serious issues that this report highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good place to leave this topic. If you want to find the EHCR report, I think it is freely available. I really would recommend reading it. It's probably one of the most. I don't want to say it's all very legally written, but it's still. I would just recommend anyone interested in the Labour Party read it because it's a very difficult document, but I think people should have to reckon with. Now let's move on to lockdown 2, electric boogaloo. Boris Johnson has announced that we are going into a second lockdown. Adam, I want to come to you for analysis. What does this mean? What are the rules we're facing? How's it different from last time?
Okay, so there are quite a few similarities to what happened last time. So we can only leave. We should ideally stay at home. We can only leave for essential business, and this is where some of it changes. So, in the last lockdown, schools, colleges, and universities were shut. Schools only had an exception if they were catering for students of key workers. In this case, schools, colleges, and universities must remain open, obviously subject to what happens in terms of virus outbreaks on their premises. So, as far as we're aware, and I believe that Vice-Chancellor Stuart Croft has actually issued a statement around this, and I imagine we'll return to this in a moment, around the fact that the university is intending to stay open, offering a blended approach to teaching. Other things are that we'll see like pubs, hospitality venues, they'll be forced to close again. Gyms, so the leisure centre on campus, I imagine will be closing come Thursday. This is all obviously subject to them passing it through Parliament. The Prime Minister is making a statement this afternoon, and it should be going to a vote on Wednesday to be brought in at midnight on Thursday.
Thank you, Adam. First I want to get some reaction on the panel from when they first heard the story. Cam, I'll come to you. What are your thoughts on lockdown 2? Do you think it's a good idea? Is it the right time?
I'm really unhappy. I'm not going to lie about this. And I think there's a big difference between this lockdown and the second lockdown. This lockdown being that we know a lot more about the virus, there's a lot less uncertainty. And also the graphs that the likes of that Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance were using in the press conference on Saturday. Obviously, we know there's a lag when it comes to hospitalizations and deaths. But apart from regions of the UK, the Northwest, the Northeast, and parts of the West Midlands, the cases and the cases have been increasing. The hospitalizations and the deaths haven't necessarily been following with that. And I think some of the predictions made about 4,000 deaths a day, I think it's very difficult. I've struggled to find that feasible personally. And I think, again, I in general, I don't support lockdowns. I think we've reached a situation now where the cure is potentially, as such, being these lockdowns, is potentially now starting to get worse than coronavirus itself. When we think about the impact on other NHS services, so elective surgeries, immediate urgent heart surgery, strokes, dementia, and then just the general economic circumstance as well. If you think about the impact on businesses, the impact on general quality of life, and of course the impact of that on your life expectancy as well. Coronavirus and the lockdowns have likely reduced people's life expectancies. We don't know by how much. And the more of these restrictions, the indirect impact, I fear, is going to be too much for the direct impact. And I think, again, if the NHS is at risk of being overwhelmed, and again, obviously that was the case that I think was presented on Saturday night, then I'd say begrudgingly support some more of these measures. But I think the government need to be putting these measures into places where they need to be more effective. Having maybe these measures in the northwest, the northeast, where the cases are high, and not putting them in Devon and Cornwall, where there's these hospitalizations, these deaths just aren't following at the moment, and you're just almost swinging an unnecessary wrecking ball into the local economy and into people's livelihoods.
Well, I mean, well, Cam, the government has been running their sort of their new tiered system was supposed to be the great clarification of what local lockdowns were. They were supposed to work in small regional areas, but clearly that's not worked. So surely now lockdowns are our only choice.
I think the problem with the tiered system is that it was introduced where we already had high amounts of cases and hospitalizations and deaths. And I think the thing is, in general, lockdown is a progression. It's an option, but lockdown it serves to buy time. It doesn't really serve to eventually stop the spread of the virus. It won't do that. It just buys you time to bring cases down for a bit. And as the graph was showing, the R rate across the country and in these regions as well, where there've been high cases recently, the R rate is going down. So yes, there's still transmission, it's still above 1, but it's going down. Transmission is starting to slow. Yes, there's going to be this lag with hospitalizations and deaths, but what the government needs to be doing is they need to be putting more resources into things like hospital capacity. The Nightingale hospitals are, a fantastic sort of resource that the government can call upon. They need to be making more use of that for COVID patients, seeing if they can open up more of them. But my fear is that the cure is just starting to get a lot worse than the disease. And let's not pretend at all that this is a horrible disease. But at the same time, I think we need to get that balance right. And I just don't think I think this isn't the right time to go into a lockdown.
I mean, I'll come to you. Do you agree with what Cam's saying?
Broadly, I do agree with what Cam's saying. I think it's important to remember that there's a human cost to COVID, as we've seen, 60,000 excess deaths and people losing their loved ones earlier than expected. It almost doesn't really matter how old or young the person is. If they've died, if you've been unable to see them, unable to attend their funeral, that really is horrific. And I think in this discussion about the future of COVID, it's important not to forget those that have prematurely lost their lives. But what's also not discussed and deserves to be that there's a human cost to lockdown and continually going in and out of lockdown, because I really don't see any sustainable argument for what the government have proposed, because if they're suggesting that they'll end it on the 2nd of December, although cabinet ministers like Michael Gove have said it could be extended, what are they expecting when we're eventually allowed out again? Cases will obviously rise and people are mingling together more, not least over Christmas. So then what's going to happen in January and February, where it's a real sort of winter crisis in the NHS? We're going to go back to lockdown again. In my mind, it's just unsustainable to continually keep sending citizens in and out of hibernation until what? Until a vaccine. Even if we get a vaccine, it won't be 100% effective until the test, track and trace system works. Well, we've had 6 or 7 months to work on that, and clearly it's not been effective enough. We've seen cases rise. It's important to remember that obviously it's terrible when every case is horrific when someone finds out they've got COVID. But the rising number of cases also reflecting that we're testing more. So it really is a double-edged sword. Our testing capacity is higher, which means more people are clearly going to see that they have COVID. So I really don't think it's the right answer in any way. I don't think it's defensible at all. And the only redeeming feature of it is the fact that schools and universities will remain open. I think Warwick have made the right decision to try and keep in-person seminars and practical work as much as they can.
Toby, I'll come to you for the final comment before we move into.
I mean,
yeah.
I'm going to agree with Cam that it's not the right time for lockdown. It's somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks too late. I mean, Sage advised against this. It must have been now 4 or 5 weeks ago. As soon as that report became public, the Labour Party called for a lockdown. While Cam talks about hospital capacity and the cancellation of other health services, we've had that in the north since about the time I came to university. My mum works in management of the health service, and essentially we were at capacity then. Nightingale hospitals, great policy, underwhelmed by the fact that we have a massive crisis in nursing in this country, thanks to a decade of Tory policy, essentially. And so all these things are part of the problem. And I agree with Cam that we can't have a perpetual cycle of lockdown, but that's what the last 7 months was supposed to be about. Test and trace is quite frankly a national disgrace. The amount of money that's been spent on it, but essentially no results. When we look at our infrastructure in this country for dealing with the pandemic compared to every other major developed country perhaps excluding the United States for obvious reasons. Like, frankly, I agree. We can't have a perpetual cycle of lockdowns. And what lockdown was supposed to do was allow the NHS to survive the winter, which without it, I think there's not a chance it would. And to allow time to build up track and trace infrastructure, testing infrastructure, so we can actually have a medium-term policy on this while we await a virus. So yeah.
Well, I mean, one question I want to ask the panel: is it fair to blame the government for this? I mean, we're seeing other governments across Europe who may have taken a stronger hand towards COVID-19 and now still having to go back into lockdown. So maybe this is just a consequence of the second wave. Adam, I'll come to you on this.
So, yeah, there's a certain amount of truth in the fact that the virus itself is at this stage pretty uncontrollable. There are things we can do to mitigate, and unfortunately for the government, they are facing a difficult decision. However, what I will say is that the government they keep saying they're being guided by the science, but why didn't they follow Sage's recommendation when it was coming out several weeks ago when the report was leaked to say that there should be a circuit break lockdown? So Sir Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party, is essentially going to have a field day with the "I told you so" at Prime Minister's questions. But the simple reason is that he told the government they needed to act. And it's all well and good saying the virus is difficult to control, but if the government aren't then acting on the scientific advice, obviously they advise, ministers decide. The ministers in this case, they I think decided too late, and they missed a trick with being able to have a shorter lockdown. So these are the consequences for it.
Yeah, well, I suppose Keir Starmer, Captain Hindsight, has become Captain Foresight. Yeah, we've also talked a little bit, but Boris Johnson was very heavily against any kind of circuit breaker lockdown, even a few days ago. But now he put us back into national lockdown. Do you think this undermines trust in the government that they managed to flip-flop almost so dramatically? Noah.
Well, of course, it's undermined trust in the government when they've said that they're for one thing and that they're against the other. And I think it's completely right to talk about not blaming those in Sage for what's happening. Ultimately, it is ministers who do decide the policies and what actions to take or not to take. They are, after all, the ones that are elected and accountable to people. But I think it's also important to remember that there's not one uniform scientific position. There is dissent among scientists, and some are more for this circuit breaker lockdown. I just call it a lockdown. I think circuit breaker is just a euphemism and sort of argument in semantics. But there are also other scientists that are more supportive of this idea called the Great Barrington Declaration, that should allow people of working age to pretty much go out and about as normal, but would provide extra protection to older people who are clearly far more vulnerable to COVID-19. So I think it's important to remember when we look at things in terms of what scientific evidence is, there's no one set view about how to most effectively tackle COVID-19, not least when it has lockdowns have such profound effects on other aspects too, whether it's health or the economy.
Yeah, well, one person who's sharing their views on how we should run the lockdown is Nigel Farage, who's reformed the Brexit Party and Reform UK, an anti-lockdown political party. Cam, so I think it's someone who maybe might have some appeal to. What do you think about Nigel Farage forming a new party?
No, I would never join. I would never join personally. Look, I think Farage personally, he's looking for, I think, a new venture. I think obviously he's had the Brexit Party. It's kind of come to an end almost. He's got what he wanted. And I think he's looking for this new venture. And I think Reform UK, the title speaks to a lot of the other things Farage has talked about over the years. Things like proportional representation, things like House of Lords reform. So for someone who is quite far on the right and quite, I would say, quite a traditional conservative, there's a lot of what Farage believes when it comes to constitutional reform that's quite contrary to that. So I think Reform UK is kind of a sort of an attempt to sort of appeal to that. And I think lockdown and the measures there, I think, have given him that sort of mandate, that sort of position, that initiative to start almost and say, this is our new identity. And I think it does have an appeal as well, because, again, I think the point Noah raised about the science, it's not just the Great Barrington Declaration, and of course some very learned scientists in there, the likes of Professor Sunetra Gupta, Professor Carl Hennigan and Professor Carol Sikora in there as well, but also the WHO, who for many people have been sort of at the forefront of this crisis and have heeded much of their advice throughout the coronavirus pandemic. They themselves have not recommended national lockdowns they don't see it as the most effective way of tackling the virus. Of course, they say it's test and trace and systems like that. And again, for this lockdown to have had to be instituted, it is a failure of government policy. It's a failure of the government to introduce an effective test and trace system and follow that recommendation, really. So I almost think Farage is benefiting from just that frustration, and I think some of the incompetence that has been shown within Downing Street on dealing with this issue.
Yeah, well, Toby, I'll come to you. What do you think about Nigel Farage's new party?
I mean, Farage is an opportunist, and we all know this. He's also a very skilled political actor, though, and I think we shouldn't underestimate him. I personally think he's a racist and a scumbag, but that's sort of an aside point on this. He's seen a gap in the market, just as UKIP did, and just as the Brexit Party did, and I worry he'll do quite well out of it. Is my main fear from disgruntled Tories. But it's again, there's no one the government can blame but themselves. They've mismanaged this on such a monumental scale, and every week new levels of that scale of incompetence. You see the story this week of a senior government minister using civil service classified documents in an event with party donors. Like the scale of the expenses, the Serco. I mean, from that stuff to the failure in the north, and sort of the utter contempt that people in Greater Manchester and Liverpool were treated with when they were told that they only warranted 66% of a furlough, and now it's a national lockdown that affects the south. That's gone up to 80%. So at the end of the day, the government only has itself to blame on this.
Yeah, well, you've touched on something there that I want to get on to. Many people say the reason lockdown was so delayed was because Boris Johnson couldn't get Rishi Sunak to sign off on it, right up until we were told the last minute on Saturday. Is Boris Johnson losing his grip on the Tory party? Is Rishi Sunak now ascendant? Adam, will come to you.
So it does really show the power that the Chancellor has, and the Chancellor's always had significant amounts of power because they're the one that controls the purse strings. Rishi Sunak really has shot up the Conservative Party ever since he replaced Sajid Javid as Chancellor, and for the most part he was lauded with great success. Although we know that Warwick, for example, actually did a study on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme that showed that has really not helped with the transmission of the virus. But yes, Boris Johnson is losing control of the Conservative Party. Sir Graham Brady, chairman of the very influential Backbench 1922 committee, looks set to probably vote against lockdown tonight, and it wouldn't surprise me if we start potentially seeing some letters into the committee to say that they have lost faith in Boris Johnson's leadership.
Do you think we could see a leadership challenge during COVID then?
Unlikely immediately. I think Boris is definitely safe until at some point early next year, and much depends then how the virus goes and how things are handled. We've seen a lot of government U-turns, and at the moment it looks like that he and the Chancellor will agree in public but disagree in private. However, we do not know how long that can continue and how sustainable that will be. And at some point, somebody will say enough is enough. We need to we need to change track in how the government are dealing with this, particularly if Sir Keir Starmer continues with his performances against Boris Johnson. And as you said earlier, moving from Captain Hindsight to Captain Foresight.
Yeah. And Cam, I'm going to have to come back to you. Is Boris Johnson losing his grip?
He is losing the support of a lot of the party membership. I know the people that I have spoken to, there is immense frustration. I think for a lot of the Tory party, I know the Tory party membership is very against a lot of these new restrictions, is very wary about the impact of, the costs of economic effects on businesses and on just quality of life as well. I think we have to remember there's a very big difference when it comes to something like the letters to the 22 with Boris Johnson there was for Theresa May, because Theresa May didn't have a parliamentary majority. She was seemingly just very weak and struggling to pass her Brexit deal. And I think the frustration on Brexit was a very different one, I think, in the sense that the Tory party felt that they were losing their power, they were losing their grip in a total sense and just not able to do anything. And Boris Johnson, of course, was the unifying figure on Brexit. Brexit was the issue that got him into the job as Prime Minister, but then also got him that majority as well. And I think that majority, despite all the concerns that a lot of the Tory backbenchers and the membership have, I think has still brought Boris Johnson some faith, especially as this is the biggest majority since Thatcher. Of course, Thatcher was eventually brought down from within the party on the poll tax. So, of course, nothing is certain. The Tory party is a fickle electorate. I think the most interesting sign was Steve Baker, who, after going into Downing Street on Saturday, came out and said, look, we have to listen to the Prime Minister. We have to challenge him in Parliament, and we'll do that. But it was a very conciliatory tone, considering how outspoken Steve Baker has been against lockdown. So I still think there's enough goodwill from the election victory that's kept Boris Johnson his job for now. But I think getting closer to 24, and we know Rishi Sunak has very much been in the ascendancy. Michael Gove is someone who has always harboured the top job. Priti Patel is someone who has a lot of the support of the Tory membership. Same with the likes of Liz Truss as well. And of course, backbenchers, Sajid Javid, Jeremy Hunt have both been very outspoken figures on the backbenches. A lot of people still believe they harbour leadership ambitions. And so I think I don't think there'll be anything during the pandemic, but certainly after the pandemic and looking ahead to the next election, I think there is a chance that the party could move away from Boris Johnson to someone they see as more a safer pair of hands, someone who they feel can kind of take on Starmer, who has effectively put himself forward as that safer pair of hands for Labour, something a bit more like him that can effectively play off and try and beat Starmer that way. I think Boris Johnson has lost a lot of that charm he used to have that carried him through, but he has enough faith to keep the job for now.
Yeah. Well, let's move away from politics. Talk about what lockdown 2 means for students. Noah, have you seen the report Stuart Croft put out about the university's plans? Could you just give us some insight into that?
Yeah, so the main report that he was highlighting, released this morning, I believe, was about obviously wanting to put public health and safety first, but mainly it was reinforcing what's already been happening since the start of term one. So that blended approach between online lectures and in-person seminars and in-person practical work. So obviously reacting to what's happened, the national lockdown, but also recognising the differences between this lockdown and the one back in March, and that schools, colleges and universities are able to remain open. I think many universities around the country have already moved all of their seminars teaching online, but I am really pleased that Warwick are trying as much as possible to keep seminars in person where they can. And so that's what he's announced today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's ask the big obvious question first. Is it actually safe to have students continue to commute onto campus and try and go to school there? Adam, will come to you.
That is a really difficult question. I think the way that they have been running seminars in person I think they've done it as safely as they possibly can. There has been the social distancing, there's been the cleanliness. I ended up seeing some of the cleaners in when I was in for a seminar the other day, and they were doing an absolutely fantastic job. So it's as safe, I think, as anywhere when we have to go out. The issue then is, are we seeing the transmission in the virus on campus? And we do know there is transmission of the virus on campus. So I believe the numbers, I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I think there were 141 cases last week, although most of them were off campus. And obviously, if they have a really solid test and trace system, which the university thus far, I think, does, then I think they can continue to do that, because it comes back to the arguments that were being put earlier, that if the test and trace system is ineffective, then you can't control it. So at the moment, I'd say yes, but it's something they should just keep monitoring.
Yeah, to put some numbers there for you, this is from Bourne News. Thank you to our friend at Bourne News. COVID cases at Warwick University. There are 141 active cases as of October 26th. 20 on campus, 121 off campus. Yeah, so those are the numbers we have so far. Toby, are you live in Leamington? I believe. Was it Kenilworth?
No, I'm living in.
You live in Elsden. Do you feel safe as a student who has to commute back into university? Do you feel safe?
I mean, I'm commuting by bike, so the risks are relatively low, unless a well-timed cough, I think. But I think it is important that we frame this discussion away from just the classroom, and bear in mind that much of the transmission hasn't been in structured spaces like seminars. Like, I think the chances of getting COVID, although there have been some cases in a seminar, are relatively slim compared to the general, less well-structured spaces. So in halls, but also in Leamington, out and about. And so I think that's a conversation that I've not seen had enough, for sure.
Yeah. Cam, now I know, Cam, you ran put Warwick Students first. You were very big on keeping teaching in person. How's this new lockdown changed your mind?
Well, I think the thing we always said, and the kind of central point about our campaign, was very much following the advice that the government had given out, which was that ultimately face-to-face teaching is the best way for students to learn. Having that face-to-face interaction is something, I can speak from my experience and a lot of other students, makes seminars run a lot more easily. And I think it just helps people understand the content. They can get into it a lot easier. Now, that's not to say, obviously, we know seminar rooms are social distancing, wearing a face mask, the cleaning. I think Adam kind of summed it up. Everyone at Warwick has been fantastic when it comes to the cleaning. And of course, there are some risks of transmission on public transport, for example, to and from campus. And I think it would be great if the university perhaps did something, for example, reduce parking prices for a bit so students could go up to campus in their households. That may be slightly easier, reduce, obviously, transmission that way. I mean, there's always a risk. I think one thing we always acknowledged is that there is always a risk of transmission, but there's a risk of transmission in whatever you do. If you have to go to the supermarket and buy food, there's a risk of transmission there, for example. And so I think it's just about taking precautions, social distancing, wearing face masks, regularly cleaning. And I think if people can do that, and again, I know certainly from my experiences on buses to and from campus, social distancing has been encouraged. They've limited people going on. So it can be done effectively. And I think it's just about taking responsibility. I think it's right that face-to-face teaching is still happening. I think it's something that we saw during the first lockdown, the impact on education. And I think it's vital that this continues, but it has to be done in a safe and responsible way. And from what I've seen so far from the university, then that is happening.
Yeah, well, obviously, in any classroom, there's not just students there, there's also teachers. Many teachers, especially at Warwick, maybe in some of the more committed, I can never say the word properly. As you can tell, I'm horrible at speaking. I'm trying to host a radio show. Many teachers are in very at-risk groups. So do you think we're now seeing teachers unions come out and say, look, we can't go back. You need to close the schools. It's not safe for us to work in these conditions. Do you think it's fair to them to make them go back to work? I'll come to you, Adam.
So on the issue with staff, I think they do need to look at how staff are feeling, because there will be some staff who live with vulnerable people, or they themselves are extremely clinically vulnerable. And I do think they have a duty to deal with that on a case-by-case basis. And it might mean that some staff should be working from home, like in the government have not reintroduced the shielding program, which I personally think was a mistake, because if we're going to be seeing virus transmission going above what it was in the previous lockdown and looking at further deaths, I do think the shielding program should then have been brought in. And then for those staff, those teaching staff or other staff that ideally would be on campus, if they then, if it was too much for risk for them clinically, then they should be encouraged to work from home, and they should be supported with the appropriate technology. And yes, it will mean some disruption to some modules, but we do know the university does have a good system in place for ensuring that they usually pair up lecturers together in terms of delivering a module. So if one can't do something in person, the other one can do. Well, at least that is the case on my course anyway. I can't necessarily comment for others.
Yeah, no, I think it's all very interesting. I also want to talk about something else. We had Luke Meth from Joy Jenkins show last week, and he said in regard to students travelling home for reading week and that kind of thing, he asked students not to do that. Do you think the new lockdown changed that situation, or are any of you thinking of going back home? No, I'll come to you.
Well, I wasn't planning to go back home anyway for reading week, and I think that if I was, or other people had been, I don't know how the new rules can justify it, given that internal travel within the UK is strongly discouraged for work. And so it's interesting because obviously this first phase of lockdown finished on the 2nd of December now. Our term for Warwick finishes on Friday the 11th of December. So it'll be interesting to see by then whether the government are more liberal about people travelling within the UK. I think the main reason they wanted to discourage discourage internal UK travel was to stop people going to their second homes overnight, which I think someone tried to do during the first pandemic. So clearly it's an inconvenience for people that wanted to go home during reading week and spend time at home. I think the only exception to that would be if people were really struggling in campus accommodation or off campus accommodation with their mental health, and they really thought that their mental health was really, really deteriorating. Then I would say that travelling home in that sense, if someone felt they'd be in a better state, would be justifiable. But I think generally it really is being discouraged, and I can understand why. The main test will be in December whether students are allowed to go home for Christmas, and I really do hope they are.
Yeah, well, I mean, sorry, when I meant travelling home now, I really should have been more specific. I'm trying to say, I know many people now think of moving home entirely because obviously we've been locked down. They probably feel more comfortable being with their families. Do you think this is safe, Cam?
I think people need to be responsible. I think that's ultimately the most important thing they can do right now. And again, if people are going home, they're going to be in lockdown. If that's better for their mental health and people can do it in a way, for example, you may have to socially distance within your home for a period of time. I think people have to be sensible about this. And I think, and again, it's that point I raised earlier about the costs as well. And I think people have to be responsible and acknowledge that, yes, that there is viral transmission at the moment and this is a horrible virus. But at the same time, you've got to be responsible and you've got to understand that people will have different circumstances and it will be extremely serious and extremely difficult for some people. And so I think if students are going to go home, I think they need to go home obviously before Thursday. They need to do it in a way that is safe, that is responsible, that when they get back to their house, they take precautions to make sure that there is no transmission to their parents or anyone else in their household, for example. And I think a lot of this is on the university as well. I think the university, should strongly encourage students to stay, unless obviously the situation gets so bad that they need to go and they need to go home. But the university needs to be putting in support, and it needs to be, I think, certainly in the next few days, reassuring students that we're encouraging you to stay on campus. We know this is going to be difficult, but we're going to do X, Y, Z to make sure you're okay. And we have all of these services available for you and they're on demand. I think the university needs to spend the next few days really reassuring students on that.
Yeah. And then final question of this segment before we go on to our last segment for today. The original lockdown order, I believe, back all the way back in March, dear God, March, was for 3 weeks. And then obviously that was extended. The new lockdown order is for 4 weeks. Now, Boris on Saturday, Boris said it would end on December 2nd. But then on Sunday, Michael Gove said that was December 2nd was just a review date. Do you think we're going to be? Do you think we're going to be here longer than 4 weeks? I'll start with you, Adam.
Yes, I think we will. I think cases are still going to be too high.
Yeah, Toby.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Toby, we can't hear you, Toby. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
Yes. Basically, completely agree with Adam. I think throughout the whole first lockdown, we all assumed at every point we're about halfway through. There'll only be another couple of weeks. And I think the idea that hospital capacity, particularly in the north of England, will be anywhere near a manageable amount within 4 weeks is it's not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it will be longer than 4 weeks. I think people have just been resigned to the fact that 2020 has been an absolutely awful year, and so it won't make much difference if it's extended an extra couple of weeks. But as I say, whenever the government ends it, it won't be that coronavirus is suddenly over as an issue. This is going to be with us long through 2021. That's going to be a pretty terrible year as well.
Yeah, and so there just leaves one person, Cam. We're going to be spending New Year's in lockdown.
I've already started making the Christmas food order, and I hope that Noah is prepared for me to spend 3 hours cooking a turkey and hopefully not giving the whole house food poisoning.
Well, on that note, we're going to leave the story of second lockdown and go on to something more exciting. Tomorrow is the big day, US election, Trump versus Biden, Senate, House, the whole shebang. And Ron has something very special planned, as you'll see in this trailer I'm about to play for you.
The big day is here. On Tuesday, America goes to the polls to decide what they want the next 4 years to look like.
Republicans and Democrats go head-to-head for control of the House, the Senate, and the White House.
Will it be 4 more years of Trump, or will Biden take the top job? No matter what happens, we'll have the latest news for you in our election night special broadcast.
Starting at 7 p.m. on election night, we'll be breaking down everything you need to know before the results come in.
Then at 7 a.m, we'll be bringing you all the results we have and what that means for the next 4 years.
You won't want to miss a moment, so tune in on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to watch all the action live on Raw 12:51 a.m.
Live on Raw 12:51 a.m.
Live on Raw 12:51 a.m.
Across campus, online, and on 12:51 a.m. This is your student radio station.
Yes, Raw is doing a special election broadcast starting at 7. Thank you. Starting at 7 p.m. tomorrow and at 7 a.m. on Wednesday morning with all the big results. Cam, would you like to talk about it? Would you like to talk about what you're doing right there?
So I am hosting first 2 hours on tomorrow night. I'll be hosting from 7 to 9 o'clock. The evening show itself tomorrow evening, 7 to 10, 9 for the first 2 hours of that. And we'll be discussing, firstly, in the first hour, the presidential race. We're going to be taking a look at some of the key policy talking points, some of the key moments of the campaign, and, of course, the key races in each state tonight, throughout the night, looking at where Trump and Biden, where they need to get those votes to get them across the magical 270. And in the second hour, we'll be looking at some of the key races in Congress as well, in the House, in the Senate, and how they will impact the presidency. It's going to be a fantastic night. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah. Cam, since this is your last chance to talk about American election before you're underneath non-partisanship laws, who do you think is going to win, Trump or Biden?
So my theory is that Biden will win the popular vote. In any normal circumstance, he will win the Electoral College. But I think because of the issues with mail-in voting, we know how much of a partisan issue that has become. And we know how much the Republicans like to emphasize voter fraud as well. I think this will be a Trump victory in the Supreme Courts.
All right, Adam, what do you think?
Well, I again agree that I think that Biden will win the popular vote. I think the Supreme Court, ideally, I don't think they'll really want to touch the election unless they have no choice. It's like playing pass the parcel with a stick of dynamite, and they don't want to be holding it when the music stops. The issue will come down to individual states, because that is the only way they can really apply it. And whether or not the 6-3 majority of Conservative justices on the Supreme Court makes a difference, I think time will tell. What I did mention last week when I was on the Johnny Jenkins show was the fact that mail-in voting could be a big issue, but it could potentially harm the Republicans more if some of those ballots are taken out of play, because we know that a lot of Democrat voters, from the looks of things, if the reporting is accurate, have been coming out early to ensure their vote is cast, whereas it's believed that some of the Republicans might be more reliant on mail-in voting. So the Republican strategists will no doubt be thinking very carefully if they start tackling it in certain swing states, and it will be swing states they focus on, like Florida and Pennsylvania, whether or not there are issues surrounding the electoral college votes. That's where there's going to be some issue.
Yeah, Toby, what do you think? I
mean, as an American citizen, I am bloody terrified, and I'll be up all night, likely with a strong drink by my side. The way I see it, there are sort of three ways it could go. Either a strong Biden victory, which I hope upon hope is what happens, or either a tight Biden victory or a tight Trump victory. In either one of those likelihoods, it's going to be months before we know. Certainly weeks. It's going to end up in the courts. I mean, there's talk of general strikes, like mass unrest. I think it's really a scary world we enter in on that. I hope, and the polling is looking good for the presidential election, but also for the House and the Senate, that we can finally move past these 4 years and get some real government in. But I won't be getting much sleep, it's fair to say.
Well, neither will I. And Noah,
Well, I'm looking forward to being part of the Raw show tomorrow evening as a state analyst, talking about Ohio in the first hour on Cam's show, and then the second hour talking about Maine. As there will be plenty to talk about. I think unless it's a really strong Biden victory, which I think is really unlikely, the result will be really inconclusive by the time we go on air at 7 a.m. I think we won't know who's won. As we say, there are so many ballots will be mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, and so as Adam was saying, it varies from state to state when they start counting, when the cutoff point will be in terms of what's allowed. And I do fear, as Cam was talking about, that the Supreme Court or some figure of authority above the Electoral College, above the voters, could get involved and actually hand Trump a second term. That's not what I want to happen, but then I think it really is what could happen.
Yeah. Well, if anyone else wants to share their opinion, what they think is going to happen tomorrow, I'm willing to give some money to charity while you're doing it. Political Society is running. They're basically running for November in the US election, event thing. And if you give £3, you tell them who you think is going to win the election, and if you're correct, they will give you a signed copy of Obama's new book. So please check that out. I'm going to post the link in the comment section here. I don't know if I'm supposed to be promoting things, but I think it's a charity, so I think that's okay. But thank you everyone for joining me today. Thank you, panel. You've been absolutely wonderful to have on. Thank you for everyone watching at home. Please do tune in tomorrow from 7 p.m. on Raw News, on the Facebook, the YouTube, the Twitter account. We will be going all through the night, just talking about all the big stories, all the big stories, all the big results. Hopefully, if we get any results. It's absolutely wonderful having you here this hour. But it's have a good week.